At precisely 11:02 in the morning on August 9, 1945, a second sun blazed to life above the city of Nagasaki. For 17 seconds, this artificial star burned with the fury of creation itself, transforming steel into vapor and shadow into memory. The men who unleashed this power believed they were ending the most devastating war in human history. They could not have known they were beginning something terrifying, more, an age where the very survival of our species would hang by the thinnest of threads. This is not just the story of one bomb or one city. This is the moment humanity crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The moment we learned to harness the fundamental forces that power the stars themselves and turned them into instruments of unimaginable destruction. What followed was not peace, but the birth of a fear so profound it would shape every political decision, every military strategy, and every sleepless night for generations to come. The weapon that destroyed Nagasaki was not the crude device that had leveled Hiroshima 3 days earlier. Fat Man, as the scientists had grimly nicknamed it, represented the pinnacle of wartime scientific achievement, a spherical monster weighing 10,000 pounds, 60 inches in diameter, containing at its heart a ball of plutonium no larger than a softball, yet this seemingly modest core held within it the power to obliterate an entire city. The creation of Fat Man had consumed years of desperate work by the brightest minds at Los Alamos, while Little Boy, the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima, operated on the relatively simple principle of firing one piece of uranium into another. Fat Man required an intricate ballet of precisely timed explosions. 32 explosive lenses had to detonate with perfect synchronization, creating an implosion wave that would compress the plutonium core to critical mass in microseconds. The margin for error was non-existent. A delay of even a millionth of a second would result in a nuclear fizzle rather than the devastating explosion the mission required. Major Charles Sweeney piloted Boxcar, the B-29 superfortress carrying this technological marvel, through the morning sky over Japan. The primary target was not Nagasaki but Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest munitions plants. For hours, Sweeney circled above the industrial city, but thick clouds and smoke from the previous night's bombing obscured the target. With fuel running dangerously low and Japanese fighters scrambling to intercept, the mission teetered on the edge of failure. The decision to divert to Nagasaki came down to a single moment of clarity. As Boxcar approached the secondary target, Bombardier Captain Kermit Beahan peered through his bomb sight at an impenetrable blanket of clouds. Then, as if the heavens themselves had chosen this moment, a hole opened in the overcast sky. Through that gap, Beahan glimpsed the Mitsubishi factories sprawling along Nagasaki's industrial district. At 11:02 precisely, Fat Man tumbled from the bomb bay toward its destiny. The bomb detonated 1,650 feet above the city with a yield of 21 kilotons. In that instant, the temperature at ground zero reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper and vaporize human flesh. The blast wave expanded outward at supersonic speed, crushing buildings like paper houses and hurling debris through the air like deadly confetti. A mushroom cloud boiled upward into the stratosphere, visible from hundreds of miles away, announcing to the world that humanity had once again proven its capacity for destruction. But the true horror of Fat Man lay not in its immediate devastation, but in what it left behind. Radiation, invisible and insidious, began its silent work immediately. Unlike the burns and broken bones that marked conventional warfare, radiation poisoning crept through the bodies of survivors like a patient assassin. Within days, victims who had seemed to escape the initial blast began experiencing symptoms that baffled doctors. Hair fell out in clumps, bleeding erupted from every orifice, and a peculiar weakness settled over those who had been exposed to the atomic fire. Midori Naka became the first person officially certified as dying from radiation poisoning. Located just 650 meters from Hiroshima's hypocenter, she had survived the initial blast and managed to travel to Tokyo before succumbing to what doctors were beginning to call atomic bomb disease. Her death marked the beginning of a new chapter in human suffering, one that would stretch across generations. The immediate casualties were staggering. 74,000 people died in Nagasaki by the end of 1945, though the mountainous terrain surrounding the city had somewhat contained the blast compared to the flatter landscape of Hiroshima. Within 1 kilometer of ground zero, human bodies were instantly crushed against walls by the blast wave, suffering multiple fractures and organ ruptures. Those caught in the open were carbonized by the direct heat rays, their shadows burned permanently into concrete and stone. The death toll estimates remain imprecise because there were simply no bodies left to count near the hypocenter. The heat and energy had literally vaporized the closest victims, while many others died seeking relief in Nagasaki's rivers, their bodies swept out to sea with the tides. Most victims died without any medical care to ease their suffering, and tragically, some of those who entered the cities after the bombings to provide assistance also died from radiation exposure. Yet even as the mushroom cloud dissipated and the immediate fires were extinguished, the true implications of what had occurred were only beginning to unfold. The atomic bombing of Nagasaki was not merely the culmination of the Manhattan Project or the final act of World War II. It was the opening gambit in a far more dangerous game that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Soviet intelligence had been tracking American atomic research long before Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki. When President Truman casually mentioned to Stalin at the Potsdam Conference that America possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force, the Soviet leader showed little surprise. He had already ordered his own atomic program to accelerate, understanding that America's nuclear monopoly represented an existential threat to Soviet power. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sent shockwaves through Moscow that had nothing to do with seismic waves. Soviet scientists and engineers, many of them already working in secret on atomic research, received new urgency and unlimited resources. The race was on to develop a Soviet bomb before America could leverage its nuclear advantage to reshape the post-war world order. What neither American nor Soviet leaders fully grasped in those early days was the profound psychological transformation that nuclear weapons would impose on human civilization. The atomic bombings had not simply ended one war, they had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself. For the first time in history, a single weapon could destroy an entire city. A small number of such weapons could potentially end human civilization. The implications were staggering and would only become clearer as the months and years passed. Military strategists on both sides began calculating not just how to win wars, but how to survive them. Political leaders faced decisions where a single miscalculation could result in the annihilation of millions. The atomic age had begun, and with it came a new kind of terror that would haunt every subsequent generation. The shadows burned into the concrete of Nagasaki would prove to be more than mere reminders of atomic fire. They were harbingers of a future where entire populations would live under the constant specter of instantaneous annihilation. Within weeks of Fat Man's detonation, the first reports began filtering out of Japan that defied everything medical science understood about warfare injuries. Victims who had appeared healthy in the immediate aftermath of the bombing began dying in ways that horrified even battle-hardened physicians. Hair loss struck first, followed by bleeding from the gums and nose. Then came the hemorrhagic fever, the vomiting that wouldn't stop, and a peculiar weakness that seemed to drain the very life force from survivors. Japanese doctors, working with limited resources in a devastated nation, struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The symptoms resembled nothing they had seen before, though some noted similarities to patients who had received excessive X-ray treatments. What they were observing was radiation sickness, on a scale never before recorded in human history. The biological devastation extended far beyond the immediate victims. Children exposed to atomic radiation began developing leukemia at alarming rates, first appearing around 1947 and reaching peak incidence between 1950 and 1954. But the cancer epidemic was just beginning. After a decade of apparent normalcy, survivors started developing thyroid, breast, lung, and other cancers at rates far exceeding normal populations. The atomic bombs had not simply killed and maimed hundreds of thousands, they had fundamentally altered the genetic code of those who survived. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, studying the psychological aftermath years later, identified a condition he termed death in life among survivors. Many hibakusha, as the atomic bomb survivors came to be known, reported feeling as though they had died in that flash of light, but somehow continued existing in a liminal state between life and death. The psychological trauma proved as persistent as the physical damage, with anxiety and depression haunting survivors for decades. Some found themselves unable to work consistently, fired from jobs when employers learned of their exposure, carrying not just the physical scars but the social stigma of atomic survival. Yet even as Japan struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had been unleashed upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, The true global implications were crystallizing in, and military installations laboratories around the world. The Soviet Union, despite American hopes that nuclear monopoly might last for years, was closer to achieving its own atomic capability than anyone in Washington suspected. Soviet physicists, led by Igor Kurchatov and aided by intelligence, gathered through extensive espionage networks, worked with desperate intensity to break America's nuclear stranglehold. On August 29, 1949, just 4 years after Nagasaki, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan. The weapon, codenamed First Lightning, was essentially a reverse-engineered copy of Fat Man, built from stolen Manhattan Project blueprints and powered by plutonium produced in hastily constructed reactors. The American nuclear monopoly had lasted less than 4 years, and the world would never be the same. President Truman received of the Soviet test through radioactive war debris collected by American reconnaissance aircraft. The news struck the White House like a thunderbolt. American military planners had assumed they would maintain nuclear superiority until at least the mid-1950s, providing ample time to consolidate post-war advantages. Instead, they found themselves facing a nuclear-armed adversary with whom tensions were already escalating across multiple fronts. The arms race that followed transformed the nature of international relations in ways that extended far beyond military strategy. Both superpowers began stockpiling weapons of unprecedented destructive power, each seeking to maintain strategic advantage through sheer numbers and technological superiority. The hydrogen bomb, developed by both sides in the early 1950s, dwarfed even the atomic weapons against Japan. Where Fat Man had yielded 21 kilotons, the first hydrogen weapons produced explosions measured in megatons, thousands of times more powerful than the bombs that had ended World War II. Military doctrine evolved to accommodate this new reality through concepts that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Mutually assured destruction emerged as the defining strategic principle of the Cold War era, based on the terrifying logic that neither side would dare launch a nuclear attack, knowing it would result in their own annihilation. The acronym MAD seemed grimly appropriate for a strategy that relied on the threat of global suicide to maintain peace. Civil defense programs sprouted across both superpowers as governments grappled with how to protect civilian populations from atomic attack. American schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, learning to hide under desks at the sound of air raid sirens. Families constructed backyard bomb shelters stocked with canned goods and water, preparing for a nuclear winter that might last for months. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of atomic warfare permeated every aspect of society, from popular culture to urban planning. President Eisenhower warned the nation about the dangers of what he termed the military-industrial complex, recognizing that the nuclear arms race was creating powerful vested interests in continued weapons development. Defense contractors, research institutions, and military bureaucracies all found their fortunes tied to the perpetual expansion of atomic arsenals. What had begun as a desperate wartime project to defeat Nazi Germany had evolved into a self-perpetuating system that seemed to have acquired a life of its own. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than most people realized at the time. For 13 days, American and Soviet leaders engaged in a deadly game of nuclear brinksmanship while their respective militaries prepared for what could have been the conflict final in human history. Soviet missiles in Cuba could reach American cities within minutes, while American Jupiter missiles in Turkey posed an equivalent threat to Soviet territory. The crisis ended with both sides stepping back from the abyss, but the experience left leaders on both sides deeply shaken by how close they had come to mutual annihilation. Behind the scenes, military commanders on both sides had pushed for more aggressive action. Soviet submarine B-59, armed with a nuclear torpedo and unable to communicate with Moscow, nearly launched its weapon before being stopped at the last moment by Deputy Brigade Commander Captain Vasily Arkhipov. Had that torpedo been fired, it might have triggered the global nuclear exchange that both superpowers were desperately trying to avoid. The near miss over Cuba forced both superpowers to confront the reality that their nuclear arsenals had grown beyond any rational military purpose. By the early 1960s, both the United States and Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. The concept of overkill became grimly literal, as strategists calculated that their combined arsenals could render the planet uninhabitable for human civilization. Yet the weapons continued to proliferate. Britain developed its own atomic capability in 1952, followed by France in 1960 and China in 1964. Each new member of the nuclear club increased the complexity of deterrence calculations and multiplied the potential pathways to accidental war. The exclusive atomic monopoly that America had briefly enjoyed after Nagasaki had given way to a world where multiple nations possessed the power to end human civilization. The technology that had been unleashed over Nagasaki possessed a momentum of its own, driving innovations that made Fat Man seem primitive by comparison. Scientists on both sides of the Iron Curtain pushed the boundaries of destruction with the enthusiasm of children playing with increasingly dangerous toys. The hydrogen bomb represented a quantum leap in devastation, harnessing the same fusion reactions that powered the sun itself. Where the atomic bombs dropped on Japan had split heavy atoms apart, these new weapons forced light atoms together, releasing energy on a scale that dwarfed even the most optimistic predictions. Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born physicist who championed hydrogen weapons development, argued that America needed thermonuclear superiority to maintain its edge over Soviet nuclear capabilities. His persistence paid off on November 1, 1952, when the United States detonated Ivy Mike, the first successful hydrogen bomb test. The explosion vaporized the entire island of Elugalab in the Marshall Islands, creating a crater over a mile wide and 160 feet deep. The mushroom cloud rose to a height of 57,000 feet, visible from hundreds of miles away. The Soviet response came faster than American intelligence had predicted. On August 12, 1953, less than 9 months after Ivy Mike, the Soviets detonated their own hydrogen device. Unlike the American test, which required a building-sized apparatus to function, the Soviet weapon was compact enough to be delivered by aircraft. Joe 4, as Western intelligence designated it, demonstrated that the nuclear arms race had entered a new phase where the destructive power available to both superpowers exceeded any rational military objective. Military strategists struggled to develop doctrines that could accommodate weapons of such overwhelming power. The concept of tactical nuclear weapons emerged as planners attempted to find battlefield applications for atomic explosives. Artillery shells, torpedoes, and even shoulder-fired rockets were designed to deliver nuclear payloads against enemy forces. The line between conventional and nuclear warfare began to blur as military leaders contemplated conflicts where atomic weapons would be used as casually as artillery barrages. NATO exercises in the 1950s regularly incorporated simulated nuclear exchanges, with commanders calculating acceptable casualty rates in the millions. The Pentagon developed elaborate scenarios for fighting and winning nuclear wars, complete with target lists that included every major city in the Soviet Union. Soviet planners reciprocated with their own strategies for nuclear conflict, viewing atomic weapons as the ultimate expression of socialist industrial might against capitalist imperialism. Yet beneath the strategic calculations and military posturing, a deeper transformation was occurring in human consciousness. The generation that came of age after Nagasaki grew up under the shadow of potential extinction, their childhood nightmares populated by mushroom clouds and radioactive fallout. Popular culture reflected this anxiety through science fiction films depicting atomic monsters and post-apocalyptic wastelands. The very concept of progress became entangled with the possibility of annihilation. Fallout shelters became a standard feature of American life during the 1950s and 60s. The federal government published detailed instructions for constructing family shelters, complete with recommendations for food storage, water purification, and radiation monitoring. Suburban families invested thousands of dollars in underground bunkers, stocking them with board games and books to pass the time during what experts predicted could be months of isolation following nuclear attack. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of atomic warfare manifested in unexpected ways. Marriage rates fluctuated with international tensions as young couples hesitated to start families in an uncertain world. Birth rates in both superpowers showed curious correlations with nuclear testing schedules, suggesting that the prospect of atomic conflict influenced even the most intimate human decisions. Psychiatrists reported increasing numbers of patients suffering from what they termed atomic anxiety, a persistent fear of nuclear destruction that interfered with daily functioning. Children born after Nagasaki inhabited a fundamentally different world from their parents, one where human extinction was not merely possible but probable. School curricula included civil defense training alongside traditional subjects, teaching students to distinguish between air raid sirens and tornado warnings. The phrase, atomic age, entered common usage, marking the recognition that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat. Religious leaders grappled with the theological implications of weapons that could end human civilization. Some interpreted nuclear weapons as evidence of divine judgment upon a sinful world, while others argued that atomic power demonstrated humanity's God-given capacity for both creation and destruction. The Vatican issued statements condemning nuclear warfare as fundamentally incompatible with Christian doctrine, while some Protestant denominations embraced atomic energy as evidence of human progress under divine guidance. The scientific community found itself torn between pride in technical achievement and horror at the implications of their work. Many Manhattan Project veterans, including Robert Oppenheimer, became vocal advocates for nuclear disarmament after witnessing the consequences of their wartime research. Others, like Edward Teller, continued pushing for ever more powerful weapons, arguing that technological superiority represented the only reliable path to national security. International law struggled to adapt to the reality of weapons that could destroy entire nations in minutes. Traditional concepts of proportionality in warfare became meaningless when single bombs could kill more people than entire armies. The Geneva Conventions, painstakingly negotiated to limit the brutality of conventional conflict, seemed quaint in an age when cities could be vaporized without warning. Espionage took on new dimensions as both superpowers desperately sought intelligence about their opponents' nuclear capabilities. The Klaus Fuchs case revealed the extent to which Soviet agents had penetrated the Manhattan Project, while American spy satellites monitored Soviet missile tests from orbit. Every technical advancement by one side triggered frantic efforts by the other to match or exceed the achievement. The atmospheric testing programs conducted by both superpowers during the 1950s and early 60s scattered radioactive fallout across the globe. Strontium-90 appeared in children's milk, while cesium-137 contaminated agricultural products thousands of miles from test sites. The concept of global contamination entered public consciousness as detect scientists traces of atomic fallout in Antarctic ice and deep ocean sediments. Public opinion began turning against atmospheric testing as the health consequences became apparent. The 1,954 Castle Bravo test exceeded its predicted yield by more than double, contaminating a Japanese fishing vessel and several Pacific islands with radioactive fallout. The crew of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 suffered radiation sickness, with one member dying from complications months later. The incident sparked international protests and contributed to growing pressure for a nuclear test ban treaty. Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy found themselves inheriting nuclear arsenals that neither fully understood nor completely controlled. Both leaders discovered that the weapon systems they commanded had acquired an institutional momentum that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult. Military advisors on both sides pushed for aggressive policies, arguing that nuclear superiority was meaningless unless potential adversaries believed it would actually be used. The concept of nuclear winter emerged from scientific studies of large-scale atomic exchanges, suggesting that even a limited nuclear war could trigger global climate disruption. Smoke and debris from burning cities would block sunlight for months, causing worldwide crop failures and potential human extinction through starvation rather than radiation. These findings added a new dimension to deterrence theory, suggesting that nuclear warfare might be suicidal even for the apparent victor. Underground testing replaced atmospheric detonations as both superpowers sought to continue weapons development while reducing public exposure to radioactive fallout. Massive excavation projects created subterranean test facilities where nuclear devices could be detonated without releasing contamination into the atmosphere. The Nevada test site became a moonscape of craters and tunnels, while the Soviet Union carved similar facilities from the permafrost of Novaya Zemlya. The nuclear submarine revolutionized strategic thinking by creating platforms that could remain hidden beneath the oceans for months while carrying enough firepower to destroy entire continents. The USS Nautilus, launched in 1954, demonstrated that atomic power could propel vessels underwater for unlimited distances. Soviet submarine technology advanced rapidly, creating underwater fleets capable of launching nuclear missiles from positions close to enemy coastlines. Arms control negotiations became a permanent feature of superpower diplomacy, as both sides recognized the need to manage the nuclear competition before it spiraled completely out of control. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric nuclear testing, while the Non-Proliferation Treaty attempted to prevent additional nations from acquiring atomic weapons. Yet even as diplomats worked to limit nuclear spread, both superpowers continued expanding their arsenals at an unprecedented pace. The atomic sun that had blazed over Nagasaki had illuminated a path that humanity seemed compelled to follow, despite growing evidence that it led toward collective destruction. Each technical breakthrough brought new possibilities for annihilation, while each diplomatic initiative struggled to contain forces that appeared to have acquired their own inexorable logic emerged from the world. That ashes of that Japanese city bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before, transformed by technologies that made gods of mortals and mortals of gods. From that moment at 11:02 on August 9th, 1945, when Fat Man blazed to life above Nagasaki, humanity stepped across a threshold that forever changed our existence. What began as an effort to end one war became the genesis of a terror that would define every generation to follow. The shadows burned into concrete that day were not merely remnants of atomic fire, but prophecies of a future where our very survival hangs in the balance of decisions made in distant capitals by fallible leaders wielding the power of the sun itself.